And I think that a lot of people, when they go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, you need to manage your stress, they say, I'm managing my stress. I'm knitting, or I'm taking a walk, or I have a dog, or I drink, or whatever it is that people do to manage stress. But what they don't realize is those practices, while they might feel good and help alleviate stress in the moment, they aren't training you. They're not helping you to train with nervous system resilience. They're not helping to shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic. That takes practice. And I always say that, you don't want to take swimming lessons when you're drowning. And so doing a daily practice is really giving yourself the opportunity to have those practices in place so that when you need them, they're there for you. That it's not really practical to say, I'm having a panic attack, now what do I do?
Welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you, and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. Susie Amendola, welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm thrilled to have you here. And I'm thrilled to have you here because, one of the things that we're realizing more and more is whether we're talking about mental health or physical health, we know that stress, anxiety, chronic sort of disruptions to our nervous system are absolutely crucial in terms of our health, our mental health, and our physical health. And that so many of our illnesses, our complex chronic illnesses, are so driven by stress and chronic stress, and that our lives, our modern lives, have become so stressful between, the smartphone and constant connectivity and processed foods and toxins and just constantly being on and light and the disruption of our circadian rhythms. And so your work is so important in terms of helping us to navigate the stress that is in our daily lives and develop nervous system resilience. So I'm totally thrilled to have you here. And before I introduce you, I just wanted also to talk about your wonderful book, The Centered Heart, and which has just come out. It's evidence-based mind-body practices to stress less and improve cardiac health. So while it's geared towards cardiac health, and we're talking more about mental health, but as we know, it's all connected. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you about it from a different angle. So, Susie Amendola, you hold both an ERYT 500, which explain what that is exactly.
That's a Yoga Alliance certification, as it's their highest certification as a yoga teacher. And then the other certification I hold is through the IAYT, which is I'm a certified yoga therapist as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so you hold an ERYT 500 with Yoga Alliance and a CIAYT with the International Association of Yoga Therapists, which is really interesting because you have both the therapeutic side and also the sort of practice side. You founded the Omaha Yoga and Bodywork Center, one of the first and oldest yoga centers in the Midwest. You've worked diligently to create programs to train yoga teachers, sponsor well-known speakers on yoga, and bring the healing practices of yoga to businesses, schools, and the community. And today your center is called Yoga Now, and since its inception in 1983, has served as a stronghold in your community, which I think is amazing. In 1993, you joined Ornish Lifestyle Medicine, which is Dr. Dean Ornish's outfit, a Medicare-approved intensive cardiac rehab program as a stress management specialist and a senior trainer. The program includes yoga and meditation as part of a multidisciplinary approach to healing. And you've had some amazing results with that program, which we'll talk about. You've traveled extensively to train and mentor hospital teams in delivering this intervention, which has been absolutely crucial in people's recovery. As you helped others with the practices that turned your own life around, and we'll hear about your story, you gathered their stories of health and healing, which served as the inspiration for your teachings and for your new book, which is the one I was just talking about, The Centered Heart: Evidence Based Mind Body Practices to Stress Less and Improve Cardiac Health. With your expertise in both the ancient practices of yoga and the medical world, your teachings and classes are unlike anything else you will find. Your teaching style is heart centered, nurturing, practical, and empowering, and you continue to practice, teach, and inspire others to listen deeply to the healer within, which I think is very beautiful. And I have to say, this book is very beautiful and very moving in so many ways, and there are so many quotes that I'd love to pull out because they're just incredibly poetic and moving, and just reading them centers us back into our body. So first of all, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, so this is your life work. Can you talk to us about how you got here, what got you here? I know it's a personal story, as so many of us, but if you tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Thank you, Kiki. And thank you so much for having me on the show today on the podcast. I'm just so deeply honored.
Oh.
Yeah, well, the experience that I had was one that happened when I was about 15 years old, and I went to a party and I smoked marijuana, and it was maybe the first time I had done that, and I had this reaction that was unlike anything that I had ever experienced, and I was unable afterwards to really function in the way that I had been functioning in my life. I was sort of riddled with anxiety. And at that time, this was many years ago, it was in the 70s. And I didn't understand what anxiety was or panic or what was happening to me. And I spent many years trying to figure out what was going on. And I had gone from being this sort of happy go lucky, sort of fun loving kid to someone who couldn't really even leave my house. So I ended up having things like agoraphobia based on the fact that I was so anxious. I couldn't drive my car. I couldn't go to school. It was really devastating. And it was at a time, like I said, when nobody talked about their anxiety. And anxiety was sort of grouped into what would be sort of the same group as any other mental health condition. And in those days, it was so unrefined that, for an anxiety person with anxiety, they would be thrown into some kind of an institution and maybe even administered shock therapy. So it wasn't something that I was really interested in talking about because I didn't want to end up like some of the people that I had heard about. So I really kind of suffered in silence for a few years. And at one point, my mom, who had been, a student of yoga, and she was a student of yoga because she had 5 children in 6 years. And so she was very young and overwhelmed and stressed out. And so she found a local yoga center that was in the north suburbs of Chicago. And there was a Swami there. And he had come to this country because he was meeting with scientists to try to show that yoga was a science and that he was really bringing the tools of biofeedback to the US. And he had come like in the early 70s. So she took me to a yoga class, and it was the first time in just a couple of years that I had had any kind of relief. And I realized, oh, this works. This is something that I can do. And, they had, at that time, there were homeopaths and there were Chinese medical doctors and there were chiropractors that were studying and doing some of the things that functional medicine does now. But there really wasn't a lot of work around the world of anxiety. And so, going to that class really turned it around for me. And while I wasn't better immediately, I sort of worked my way through and back to myself after many years using some of the techniques of yoga. And I ended up moving to a yoga ashram and studying and staying there for many years. And so it kind of shaped, all of the work that I'm doing now because I really used yoga as a tool for mental health, for managing my mental health. And I think that was something that, was kind of new back then. I think yoga was really a spiritual practice then, not so much used for managing mental health. But for me, that's the thing that worked.
That's amazing. And in terms of mental health specifically, I mean, we know that there's an epidemic of mental health issues at the moment. And you talk in your book about the sort of stats, and that, 75 to 90% of visits to the doctor are due to stress, essentially, or
Mhm.
stress related.
Mhm.
And we know that there's an epidemic, especially among young people, adolescents, but also amongst, all of us, in terms of anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism. I mean, all these huge increases, suicidality. So, how do you see, given this sort of epidemic, what is the benefit that you have found personally, but also professionally, in terms of yoga and meditation practices? And what sort of effects on the physiology do you think are the key ones in terms of helping people with their mental health?
That's a great question. And I think that yoga really offers a lot in the world of mental health because it works with the nervous system and it builds nervous system resilience. And it helps to reduce anxiety and depression, but it also works with changing mindset, which I think is a big part of mental health as well. So, given that, there's a lot of, like you said, the CDC is saying that, 75 to 90% of the doctor's visits are for stress related illness. And right now, I think three-quarters of adults are saying that they're more stressed this year than last year.
Wow.
And there's also a lot of really interesting statistics from the CDC on workplace stress. People are really feeling stress in their workplace. And I think they're saying now that 120,000 people die every year from stress related, work related stress, which I think that's just a huge number. So I think that it's something that, we really need to be thinking about in a big way is how stress is affecting our mental health. And that yoga really does offer the tools for really supporting our mental health and well being.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you talk a bit about how yoga has an effect on inflammation, on our neuroendocrine system, so
Mhm.
hormones and neurotransmitters, on our
Mhm.
immune system regulation, heart rate variability, blood pressure. I mean, you talk a lot in the context of cardiac health, but we know that all these things are so linked to our mental health as well. And I mean, I know they've done studies in terms of, the inflammatory markers and neurotransmitter increases,
Mhm.
for instance, in GABA and serotonin,
Right.
decrease in excitatory neurotransmitters, better immune system regulation, heart rate variability, blood pressure. You've been intimately involved with some of these studies. And there is a lot of essentially evidence to support the
Mhm.
benefits, the physiological benefits of yoga on the nervous system. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the salient ones that sort of stand out for you in terms of?
Well, it's really interesting because when I first started working with these practices and when I started working with the Ornish program, there wasn't a lot of research. In fact, when Medicare came around, they wanted some research and it was really hard to find because a lot of the research on these specific techniques, and we can talk about what they are, but they hadn't really been researched anywhere but in India because India is where yoga kind of originated. So there were a lot of Indian studies, but there weren't a lot of American studies. So it was really hard to find sort of details of, what does breathing do with, what's the effect of breathing on our health and well-being? What's the effect of postures or movement? What is the effect of meditation? But now the internet is just filled with studies. So now when I sort through all of them, I'm kind of looking for detailed, like what kind of meditation are they doing here? Or what kind of breathing practice are they doing to help relax the nervous system? What are the very specific ones? And so what's been interesting is like, I still really like some of the Indian research because they're very specific. They'll say, here, like one study that I cite in the book was a friend of mine in India who did a study on yoga and just one yoga session being able to bring down blood pressure in just one session. So there's a lot of research like that out there, and you kind of have to look for it very specifically and then see. But I really appreciated being able to go to PubMed and find all kinds of research on these different techniques. And now with mindfulness being such a big thing, there's a lot of research in mindfulness, and with transcendental meditation, there's a lot of research around meditation. So, there's a lot of them that stand out. But I think that the biggest thing right now is just that there is research. That there is a lot of research that you can find, and you can find it easily. And one of the things that we had trouble with in the Ornish program was that a lot of people wanted research, or they didn't want to do the practices. And then when we give them research, they'd want more research. That wasn't good enough. That didn't prove this part. It only proved this part. And so we want this part proven. And I think what happens sometimes with research is that it's so engaging and it's so interesting, and it can be really inspiring, but it can also get in the way of people taking on an actual experience. And I think that what I've seen over the years is that when people feel better, they usually are better, and that the research often matches what they're saying their experience is in doing these practices. So someone will come in and they'll start doing these practices and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, I feel so much more relaxed, and I feel so much less aggravated, and the things that used to bother me don't bother me anymore." And then we'll check their blood numbers, and we'll check their other numbers, and sure enough, everything has changed. Their blood pressure has come down. All of those relating factors match, which is really nice to see.
Completely. And I mean, you talk about this in your book, and you talk about the evidence of, heart rate variability
Mhm,
improvements and blood pressure improvements
mhm,
and inflammatory cytokine improvements. And so, the research is there, and it's fantastic. And, we also know that there have been a lot of neuroscience studies in terms of the gray matter in the brain and meditation and sort of,
mhm,
increasing the barriers and increasing the gray matter, and I think strengthening also barrier permeability through meditation. There have been some interesting studies on that, whether the gut permeability or the blood-brain barrier. And we know, for instance, that conversely, stress really does damage these membranes, these cell membranes, which are so crucial. And so, in terms of, so you've had the benefit of really working on the front lines with people with
mhm.
cardiac issues, and you've seen the results. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the results that you saw from the practices through the Ornish program?
Yeah. So thanks for asking that. One of the things that happened really early on in the program was that doctors didn't really know sometimes what to do with their patients in the Ornish program, because they weren't quite sure. It was a lifestyle program, and these were patients that were ready to go in for surgery. Maybe they needed a stent, maybe they needed bypass. And so the program was originally approved as a secondary measure, meaning it wasn't approved as a prevention measure, but it really was in some ways a prevention measure. But they were using it so that people wouldn't have to come back. And when we started a study with Mutual of Omaha, and it was a lifestyle study. And one of the things that happened was that Mutual of Omaha saved about $30,000 per patient per year when they put them in the Ornish program. And I thought that was fascinating. And during that study, there were a couple people that doctors at our hospital didn't know what to do with, because they were on the heart transplant list. So they said, "Hey, why don't you just go in the Ornish program for now while you're waiting for your heart?" And what happened was, about 6 weeks in, they came off the transplant list. And we
Wow.
saw this over and over again over the years. I've been working with them now more than 30 years, and we see it happening regularly, that people who are on the heart transplant list come and do the Ornish program, and they come off the heart transplant list because they're too well to need a heart.
That's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
that's totally amazing. And when you talk about the Ornish program, presumably that's not just yoga, it's also sort
Mhm.
of other lifestyle factors,
Mhm.
diet, etc. Can you tell us a little bit about what other things are involved in that?
Yeah, it's four equally weighted interventions. And so those four interventions are a diet. And his particular diet for heart disease is basically vegan. It's a low-fat vegetarian diet. And so that's one of the interventions. And it doesn't hold any more weight than the other three. The other is moderate exercise. And one thing we notice is that, exercise for mental health and for physical health is incredible. But there's a point at which it can be too much, where people can overexercise. And some of the interesting research on marathon runners isn't what you would expect. It's not that they end up healthier. I think there's more wear and tear. So it's moderate exercise in his program. So it's 20 to 30 minutes of walking, or maybe riding a bike, or dancing, or swimming, things like that. So moderate exercise each day. And then additionally, talking about your feelings in a group. So we call it group support, where people talk, and they talk with parameters. It's sort of compassionate listening that they do. People are able to talk about their feelings without being judged, and without being sort of without their stories being co-opted by other people trying to help them. They just listen with compassion and understanding. So that's also considered part of the stress management. But stress management, which is the stress management piece, which I delivered, really was 4 different interventions. It was gentle movement, relaxation, breathing, and meditation. And actually, later on, we added imagery. So there were 5 interventions. And in my book, I talk about 7. I added on the practice of compassion and how important that is for managing stress, and also living in harmony with nature, being able to just live in harmony with nature. It's something that I think you may have alluded to in the beginning, but the way that we're so stressed out and we're always looking at our phones and we're in these offices and we're not connecting to the world around us. We spend all this time sort of looking down at our phones, and that's to take the place of connecting with others. So, or connecting with nature. So I added that to the book as well.
Yeah, and I love the way you detail each one of those 7 parts, and you take us through different exercises, and you talk about the importance of compassion also statistically in terms of healing, and that basically they found that doctors who are more compassionate and better at compassionate listening have better outcomes with their patients, which is
Yeah.
fascinating. And
Mhm.
so, and the other thing that when I speak to you, I think a lot about is the sort of, the Stephen Porges polyvagal theory, which is all about how important being in a state of, parasympathetic so that you can rest and digest and so that you can heal. And the importance of social engagement as well when you talk about group therapy, and the fact that for your nervous system it's essential to have that component of connecting to other people.
Mhm.
And so presumably in this sort of yoga meditation relaxation practice, part of it was the group dynamic and connecting with other people, I would imagine.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think Dean Ornish himself wrote a book about love and survival and the importance of connection and being, in a group. And I think even in my own story, part of my own healing was being in a yoga ashram and being in a community. And I think that that really is a big part of it. And I think the yoga stress management practices are about connecting to yourself, and the group support is about connecting to family and loved ones and community. And yoga and this kind of understanding ourselves helps us to connect with others as well. So they really go hand in hand.
And I also love what you said in the book about compassion towards the self as well as towards others, and
Mhm.
there's all that idea of self-compassion, which is so important. And so
Yeah.
would you say that when you practice meditation and yoga, is it, do you need a balance between practicing on your own and connecting with yourself versus practicing in a sort of environment where you're with other people? And I think a lot of people nowadays are practicing yoga at their home on apps, on their phones. And so they don't get to real classes. How
Yeah.
important is it to get to real classes where you're interacting with other people?
That's such an interesting question. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to practicing with other people. One of the disadvantages is that we tend to lose ourselves when we're in a group. We tend to sort of modulate to the group around us, and we often will give up our sense of ourselves when we're in a group. We don't tend to stay focused on what we need. So, the advantage of doing it with an app or at home is that you can stay present with yourself a little bit easier. But the advantage of doing it in a group is that you have that group to practice with, so that you're practicing staying with yourself when there's other people around. So that, if the person next to you is doing, say, a cobra pose, and they're bending in a way that you couldn't imagine, then you have to work with that internally. Like, how am I going to stay with what I can do right here, right now? And I remember years ago when I was practicing in the ashram, there were always people that could bend in ways that you couldn't imagine, and I couldn't. And it was really my lesson when I was in class with them to stay with my experience in my body and what my body was telling me. And I think that that's, I always say when I talk about these centering movements and these movement practices, I always say that that there's a saying in Ayurveda that disease knocks 3 times, and if you don't listen, it takes you. And that postures are really the opportunity to listen and to drop in and to have an experience with your own body. And I think so many of us leave our bodies for whatever reason. We leave because of trauma, we leave because of competition, we leave because we're not good at it. We leave for all different reasons. And so postures are really a way to call yourself back. And so when you ask about being in a class, it's hard to call yourself back when you're watching everybody around you and you see everyone around you. But it's also good practice to work with that a little bit. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but
Yeah, no, it really does. And the other thing that occurs to me is, and I was actually going to allude to that, was the fact that so many of us who've experienced trauma in childhood have a tendency to dissociate and to leave our bodies. And I think, one of the things we're moving away from in mental health treatment at the moment is sort of the CBT, the cognitive talk therapies, and we're moving towards more evidence-based somatic therapies. And we're realizing more and more that so much of our trauma and our difficult and chronic stressors are stored in our cellular memory and imprinted at a very young age in our amygdala and in our sort of, in the lower parts of the brain rather than the prefrontal cortex, which are the much more cognitive parts, and the lower parts of the brain that are very connected with our visceral parts of our body, our organs. And we know, for instance, that the vagus nerve is 80% afferent, which means it goes from the gut and the organs of the body to the brain and not the other way around. And so I think what's so important about these sort of somatic therapies and also somatic practices, such as movement and yoga, is that it brings us back to our bodies. And, as you were saying, the postures, the asanas are so critical to helping us become more body aware and less dissociated. Do you see, I mean, is that a key component for you in terms of the healing? Is this ability to get back into our bodies? And would you say that then yoga is almost could be classified as a somatic therapy?
yeah, I don't think almost. I think it is a somatic therapy. I think it really is. I think what happened was that when some of the yoga practices came to this country, we as Americans really picked up on the movement piece, but we picked on the movement piece as exercise. And I think we lost the part of yoga movement, which was really somatic, which is about really being in your body and paying attention to the information that the body is giving you. And when you move in an effort to exercise, it's a different practice. It's really almost like you're outside of yourself. And so the kinds of practices of yoga that I was trained in and that I think are really important are those somatic ones where we actually come in and we listen and we move in a way that we can pause in between the movements. We move and then we pause. So a lot of the yoga that we've seen is kind of a Simon Says yoga. You do this, the teacher shouts it out, or you move straight through like a flowing practice, which are all lovely and they're nice forms of exercise. And they are rarely the kinds of practices that you can do somatically because they move too quickly. They don't take time to pause and listen, and they don't really acknowledge your own personal experience. So I think that the yoga world in general is moving away from that kind of yoga more and more into the somatic practices of yoga because they're so key in regulating our mental health. And you mentioned a little bit about the nervous system in Stephen Porges, and I just want to say that yoga has really been so keen on the nervous system and just the breathing practices alone. There's a breathing practice called alternate nostril breathing, and alternate nostril breathing is really key for all mental health and for all nervous system because our right nostril breath connects to our active or our sympathetic nervous system. So our nasal dominance changes every hour to hour and 45 minutes. So there is always one side of the nasal passages that's more open than the other. There's a kind of tissue that's in the nasal passages that's much like erectile tissue. It swells and then it relaxes. And so that switching is also the switching, it switches our nervous system from side to side. So the left nostril is connected to the parasympathetic nervous system. So we are constantly moving between the two every hour and 45 minutes. And because of our modern life and because of stress, that switching gets interfered with. So practices like alternate nostril breathing, where you shift the nostril dominance from side to side to help keep that nostril dominance, that nasal rhythm happening, that's really important for our mental health. So there's times when both nostrils open evenly, and one time is at sunrise and another time is at sunset, which means we are intimately connected to nature through our breath. We are connected because our nasal passages respond, our nervous system responds to what's happening with the sun and the moon and what's happening with sunrise and sunset. And the other time that happens is during meditation. Both nostrils open evenly. So there's a balance that happens in the nervous system during meditation that, is something that is hard to kind of understand unless you have the experience of sitting and noticing that when you're in that meditative experience, you have this sort of free flow of energy through the nostrils, which is right and left, right? Parasympathetic and sympathetic are in balance at that time. And it's also balancing the hemispheres of the brain as well. So there's other times that happens too. And that's when the nostril dominance is switching from right to left. There's a moment when they both open evenly. So there's a moment when we're in balance in between that. And it's really interesting because we don't notice it until we have a cold. So when you have a cold, you can really tell, hey, I'm breathing through one side. And then after a while, it switches and you're breathing through the other side. But when it switches for a moment, and almost everyone knows this experience, both nostrils open evenly for just a moment. And you think, oh, I can breathe. And then one shuts and the other opens. And so that's the sort of natural rhythm. And it's our breath, it's our breath's way of trying to sort of regulate our nervous system. So they'll say in the tradition of yoga that every disease pattern has a breath pattern that is prior to that we have a breathing pattern that affects our disease pattern. And they'll also say that, the breath and the mind are so intimately linked that how we breathe affects how we think and how we feel. And how we think and how we feel affects how we breathe. So it changes. So like if we change what's happening with our breathing, we can change what's happening in the mind. And when the mind is all chaotic, say we're having a panic attack or we're really stressed out, it's represented in the breath, how we breathe. And one of the patterns that I noticed with people with heart disease was that they have a pattern of breath retention. So they'll inhale and they'll hold the breath. And this isn't the conscious breath retention that we do sometimes in breathing practice. It's an unconscious breath retention, an unconscious holding. And you'll see this a lot. A lot of our patients need CPAP machines because they're having this sort of breath retention in their sleep as well. And so it's a really interesting connection that we have, an intimate connection we have with breath and our mental health, with breath and the mind.
Well, it's so interesting. You've raised so many interesting issues. I mean, one is the sort of circadian rhythms. It's almost like our breathing and our nostrils have their own circadian rhythm. Just as we know, the cells in our gut have their own, and the microbes in our gut have their own circadian rhythm. We know that, our every cell in our body is affected by our circadian rhythms. And that's why, jet lag can be so disruptive to our health and getting enough morning sunlight. But I had no idea that it actually affected the tissue in your nostrils. And
And I would just add that the tissue in our nostrils is affected by our thoughts. So that if you were just to think about, I want my right nostril to open, you could switch your nostril dominance just by thinking.
wow. That's amazing. And
Yeah.
also the fact that, you know, one nostril is connected to your sympathetic and the other one to your parasympathetic, that's extraordinary.
Mhm.
And so there's so much going on also in terms of, you know, presumably in terms of regulating your nervous system and regulating your parasympathetic versus your sympathetic through breath. And I know that you have so many wonderful techniques in your book in terms of breathing. What would be sort of one that you would say, okay, if you're feeling panicked, or you're super anxious, what's
Mhm.
your sort of, and I know there are many, but what would be the basic one that you would recommend?
Yeah, I have two or three go-to breaths for anxiety that I've used that I really love. But one of the real simple ones is just seeing if you can let your exhalation breath get twice as long as your inhale breath. And it takes a little time to do it, like meaning that it may take several breaths for that to regulate. You might start out just working with even breathing so that if you're inhaling to the count of three, you're exhaling to the count of three. And you might stay in that inhale to the count of three and exhale to the count of three for several breaths. And then you might start letting your exhale breath extend to the count of four or five. And once you can do that, you might see if you can let it extend to six or maybe even longer. And that letting the exhalation breath extend, our inhale breath is connected to the sympathetic nervous system, the exhale to the parasympathetic. So that relaxation response happens with the exhalation breath. So as you spend more time with your exhalation breath, you're upregulating your parasympathetic nervous system. And our sympathetic nervous systems, interestingly enough, are always turned on. Our parasympathetic has to be turned on because the sympathetic needs to be turned on so that we can respond to things quickly, to danger, imminent danger. So we want to be able to fight or flee. But our parasympathetic has to be turned on. So these practices, the practices that I outline in the book and the practices of yoga, are really about ways to upregulate that parasympathetic nervous system. How do we turn it on? How do we flip the switch from sympathetic to parasympathetic? And
And
there's
one of
lots of ways to do that.
And there are lots of ways that you outline. And, you know, one of the things I also love is that you mention time and time again in the book the importance not of incorporating these practices into your daily routine, sort of fitting them in, because the daily practice is crucial, but in actually organizing your daily routine around these practices. And that is really life changing. And so you say that many times. You say, you know, it's not about trying to squeeze them in. It's about really organizing your life around these routines. And so if you were to you know, advise somebody who was feeling anxious and depressed and having some real challenges with mental health, what are the key practices that you would try and anchor in their daily routine and then say, look, work everything else around these, say, two or three daily practices?
Yeah, well, that's a good question because the seven that I recommend are all awesome. And when you put them together, they create this really powerful healing path. But I do think that you can, I have a whole program, a 30-day challenge that I give people who need more support. The book comes with audio practices that you can download so you can do them in 3-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute, 20-minute, 30-minute practice sessions. So you want to choose what's going to work best for you and for your life. And so I really think that someone who's really suffering, 30 to 60 minutes is a nice period of time to allot for yourself. And what you can't get in one day, you can always do the next day. So you might one day focus your practice on doing some of these very gentle movements with awareness and breath, and then complete with a kind of deep relaxation practice. The next day, you might do some breathing practices and you might complete with a meditation practice. So that's how you can kind of use all of the practices over a period of a week. If you have a dedicated time frame of 30 minutes or 45 minutes, you can start to sort of plug in these practices. And I talk about how to do that. And I also give all different practice sessions that you can use for yourself. But I think that what you said, Kiki, and I think it's really important, is this idea of making your stress management important. And I think that a lot of people, when they go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, you need to manage your stress, they say, I'm managing my stress. I'm knitting or I'm taking a walk or I have a dog or I drink or whatever it is that people do to manage stress. But what they don't realize is those practices, while they might feel good and help alleviate stress in the moment, they aren't training you. They're not helping you to train with nervous system resilience. They're not helping to shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic, and that takes practice. And I always say that, you don't want to take swimming lessons when you're drowning. And so doing a daily practice is really giving yourself the opportunity to have those practices in place so that when you need them, they're there for you. That it's not really practical to say, I'm having a panic attack. Now what do I do? But it is practical to do these every day and say, wow, the things that used to trigger me and cause panic aren't doing that anymore because you have this sort of daily routine. And in those moments where you fall a little bit off, you can do a subtle practice of alternate nostril breathing. You could do a little, 2-to-1 breathing. You could do a little relaxation, and it will plug you back in to your daily practice and that feeling of what it feels like to be in your parasympathetic nervous system, how it feels to be relaxed. You can get there very quickly if you have a daily practice.
100%. Susie, hold on 2 seconds. I'm just going to. Oh, okay, so I'll keep recording. So that was fantastic. So you just finished that point, and so the other thing in terms of one of the things that I find interesting also about the sort of polyvagal theory and nervous system theory is that, it's not about having, no stress. I mean, we know that there's going to be stress in life, right? It's about how you respond to that stress and how adaptive and flexible your nervous system is to stressors, essentially. And so, and the whole idea around, Bessel van der Kolk's body keeps the score is that it's not so much in the event and the stressor, it's in how your body responds to that stressor. And a
Mhm.
lot of that depends on the health and the resilience of your nervous system, right? And so, what your practices teach us is to really improve the resilience and the health of our nervous system so that we're more resilient to the inevitable stressors which will come in our lives.
Mhm. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I do think that, we absolutely can't affect what's happening around us, but we can affect what's happening inside of us. And, these practices, all of them together, really that's what why I wrote the book, because I think that people often don't know, well, what do I do? How do I manage my stress? And so this was really, sort of here are the tools, and you can choose all of them or you can choose a few of them, but they definitely will help you change the way you're reacting and responding to stressful situations.
And you personally, Susie, are there any of these particular exercises that you have found most helpful to you?
Yeah, I think that I mean, it's hard to pick out one because I think they're all so incredible. But the one that I keep coming back to, I think, is relaxation. I
Mm.
think that relaxation is something that, we all need and we don't realize that we're not getting. And I hear it over and over and over again when people come to classes. They'll leave after the relaxation exercise and they'll say, I've never felt this relaxed in my life. I didn't even know I was stressed until I had this experience of being relaxed. And I think that we're all carrying around so much stress, so much tension in our bodies that we don't really know how to let go. And that practice is a learned, relaxation is a learned and conscious letting go. And, in the end of it all, we all have to let go of everything. So why not practice every day, letting go just a little bit, letting go? And the more we're able to practice that, the more we're able to sort of create space. It's sort of like, when you clean out all your stuff out of your basement, and then you're like, wow, that feels so spacious. Relaxation is kind of doing that daily. It's a daily digital detox. It's a daily sort of, reboot. It's a daily way of letting go of all of those things that we're holding on to. So I think that relaxation, and because it doesn't require us to sit upright or to do anything fancy, we can just do it in almost any position. I think that it seems to be one of the practices that people can grab onto kind of quickly, and it has a really powerful effect right away. So people feel the effect quite immediately. So I think that that's one of the things, and also that it rests the body and the mind deeper than sleep. So the difference is that, in deep relaxation, you're conscious,
Mm.
whereas in sleep, you're unconscious. And so there's a practice called yoga nidra, which is called yogic sleep. And the teacher that I studied with, um, he could put himself in yoga nidra. He only slept 2 to 3 hours a night because he did this practice called yogic sleep. And I think that with all of the information on how important sleep is to the nervous system, to just regain, to the organ systems, to everything, to just regaining, our health, I think that relaxation is really one that I think everyone should start with. I mean, that's a jumping off place.
Well, that's amazing. You've said three things that I just wanted to pick up on. The first one was the fact that some people are not aware of how tense and stressed they are until they actually learn to relax. So there are a few things. One is the fact that we have to learn to relax because our modern lifestyles have, and the way we're brought up and the way our societies are, mean that it's something that we don't do naturally. So when you see a baby, they're completely relaxed, but then circumstances will affect that baby, and as they grow up they'll become more and more stressed and tense and hold all this tension in their body and not realize that they're, because we're the only people who are in our bodies, so we don't
Mhm.
know how stressed we are. So that's the first thing is, I think you're right. So many people probably carry so much tension without being aware of it. And practicing these exercises teaches us to let go and to relax in a way that then makes us aware of how tense we've been. The second thing you said, which I thought was great, was this idea of surrender and letting go, because we're all going to have to. And you talk about that in your book, and the, Shavasana, which is sort of the corpse pose in yoga, which is this deep relaxation pose, and how it can actually help people who have a fear of death and dying,
Mhm.
myself being one of them, in a way of just sort of letting go. And so if you're a hypochondriac, or if you're facing an illness, or you're facing your mortality, is this a good thing to practice?
Mhm.
And then the third thing that you talk about is, okay, so I've forgotten this. I'm gonna have to cut this out. There was a third thing which I'm trying to remember, and I can't. So if you can just talk about that a little bit, about the fact that, this, if you're facing your mortality, like
Mhm.
this sort of surrender and letting go, is that something that would be useful to practice? And also, if you're somebody who's very disembodied and you're not aware of how tense you
Mhm.
are, how important is it to become attuned to the fact that you are so tense, and that you need to learn to practice this relaxation for your health and your healing?
Yeah, both of those are really important points. I just want to go back and just talk about this idea of using relaxation as a way to sort of face your mortality. I think it's a wonderful practice if you're ready for it. Sometimes people aren't ready for that practice. If you have a lot of trauma, if you have a huge fear of death, you want to start maybe using relaxation practices with your eyes open,
Yeah.
just sort of gently closed, so that you don't, so you feel like you're still here. You can feel your connection to being here. And in time, it's like training, like anything. I was going to say that years ago, I went, and I say this in the book, I went to sit with the Dalai Lama when he was in Los Angeles, and he was speaking to all of his monks. And so he was speaking about Buddhist texts, and he was not even speaking in English. He had a translator. But one of the things that he did say in English, which I thought was amazing, was that we should all practice dying every day.
Mm.
That's something that we don't do here. We don't look at our mortality. And I realized as soon as it came out of his mouth that that's what the practice of relaxation is. It's the practice of learning to die to the past, to die to the future, and to let us be fully present in this moment, because that's really all we have. And so that practice of dying is also helping us practice living. It lets us live more fully in the present.
Yeah.
So that was one of the gems. The rest of his lecture went right over my head, but that gem stayed with me for many, many years. And I think that it is a really important practice. I also think that people who aren't used to being in their bodies, um, practicing relaxation can also be scary
Mm,
because it can feel like you're sort of, as you relax and you spread out, it can feel like you're kind of losing your connection to your body a little bit, that
mm,
you're creating so much space that it feels scary. So, the reason I have so many different practices in the book under each one of the different techniques is because it really has to suit you. And that's one of the problems that has happened in the world of meditation, is that people think there's one way to do it. And you sit up and you sit straight and you follow the breath, and that's all you do. Except there's people that have COPD, and there's people that have asthma, and there's people that have trauma. And so how do we use these practices if they're not suited to us? So that's why I gave so many different ways of practicing. And in the relaxation techniques, it's no different. You can practice with your eyes closed. You can practice with your eyes open. You can practice sitting up,
mm,
until you can kind of train yourself to be comfortable with those still spaces,
mm.
until you can be comfortable with that feeling of letting go. So little by little, it happens naturally. So it's not something that we force upon ourselves. That's what's so beautiful about yoga is it's very systematic and it's very gentle. And so it's meant to be done over a long period of time so that we're kind of training ourselves with ease and with grace so that it's not so shocking and it's not so difficult. And so, oftentimes people talk about trauma sensitive yoga, and really, yoga is trauma sensitive in many ways, just in and of itself. Just the practice of it is. But how we adjust it and give permission to ourselves is how we make it more trauma sensitive.
Well, that's really an important point because I do know that, people who have endured childhood trauma, a lot of the time the stillness is terrifying
Mhm.
because it was in moments of stillness that they were the most vulnerable. And so, they can have flashbacks, and meditation can be very triggering. And so I think your point is really important, is that, you have to adapt the practice that suits the person the most, whether it's the
Mhm.
eyes open or whether it's, movement, or whether it's, I mean, some people just find that emptiness, that stillness triggering. And
Mhm.
so you have to be aware of what triggers you and, work around that. And I think that's hence the importance of working with a good yoga therapist or a meditation therapist or a somatic therapist to help you navigate that. And the other point that you made earlier was about sleep. And I was amazed that this guy, you were talking about sort of slept 2 to 3 hours a night and then spent a lot of his day in sort of deep relaxation. And I've heard that about deep meditators. They need less sleep because they're getting a lot of that brain detoxifying, sort of brain rejuvenation and cellular healing in their meditation practice. And do you think, I mean, because you talk about sort of relaxation, deep relaxation as being conscious rather than sleep, which is unconscious, are there benefits to this deep relaxation that go beyond sleep, or is it just a similar sort of thing?
Wow, I've never really thought of it that way. I mean, yes, I think there are benefits that go beyond sleep, that go into more of the spiritual benefits of, this deep rest and this sort of letting go of the boundaries of the body. We are able to feel ourselves more part of the world around us, a universal kind of consciousness. So it gifts us that understanding that we are part of something much bigger. And like we talked about, that's what happens, of course, at death, is that we become part of this universal consciousness. We're no longer embodied. We're sort of free of our bodies. And where does that consciousness go? And so in those practices of meditation and relaxation, we're tapping into where that consciousness goes. What is that place where consciousness resides? And I think that's one of the deeper benefits.
That's really beautiful. And it's interesting because I think, a lot of us also, when we fall asleep with our worries, with our anxieties. And we'll often, I don't know about you, but I know that myself and a lot of other people I know will wake up sort of at 3 or 4 in the morning, having not really metabolized the anxiety that we've carried with us to bed. Whereas if you're meditating, if you're in deep relaxation, in some ways you're metabolizing the anxieties and the stress in a way that might be more constructive than when you just fall asleep and then you wake up having not metabolized or processed any of those anxieties.
I completely agree with that. And there, in a lot of the healing traditions, they'll say that you should never go to sleep exhausted,
Yeah.
that you should go to sleep when you still have energy, because then the body can replenish itself. And it's the same way with the mind. You don't want to go to bed worried and afraid, and because you're right, then the mind doesn't get to fully rest.
Yeah.
So a lot of times I encourage people to do deep relaxation right before they go to sleep. And if they fall to sleep after, great,
Yeah.
because then their sleep is deeper, or to practice meditation right before sleep. But it doesn't work for everyone. Some people, and I know that at times, if I do meditation right before I go to bed, I become so re-energized that I start cleaning my closets and working. So for me, meditation is better first thing when I wake up. It helps me to align for the day. It helps to sort of set me in the right tone for the day. But it's not true for everyone. And I think that's what's so important, is that it isn't always one size fits all. It really requires us sort of tuning into our needs
Yeah.
and really tailoring our practices.
100%. Well, I must say, Susie, you're amazing. This is amazing. And I was just wondering if before we end, we could just do a meditation practice or a breathing practice or a relaxation practice, whatever you would like us to experience. I think, would be wonderful. So, if you could just guide us, that would be wonderful for a few
Well,
minutes.
I'd love to. I think I'd like to lead us in a centering practice, because you can do it sitting in a chair. And if you're at home and you want to lie down, you can go lie down on your bed as well. That will work. But I'll invite everyone to get comfortable. And so that might be a different position for everyone. But I'm just going to assume that most of you will be sitting. So I'm just going to invite you to find that comfortable position. And then just take a few conscious, slow, deep breaths. And just start to make that transition from busyness to stillness. That transition from thinking and doing to feeling and being. And just begin to gather yourself right here in the spaces of this room, allowing yourself to arrive. And now begin to feel yourself from the inside. Taking a moment to just scan your own body from top to toe. And just notice any patterns, any tensions that you may be holding in your body, that you may be holding in your mind. Notice the areas that are calling out for your attention. And begin to send a wave of relaxation from the top of your head to the soles of your feet every time you exhale. So there's a slow in-breath and a long, slow out-breath as you smooth out those patterns of tension and resistance that are within your reach. Smoothing out those patterns that you're willing and able to let go of. And you may even take your attention directly into those areas that are calling out, one at a time, as if you could let your breath pass in, around, and through, using your breath to gently unwind those patterns within your reach. softening with every exhalation breath. The exhalation breath is cleansing, detoxifying. The inhalation breath is nourishing, nourishing and cleansing with each breath. And after letting go of those patterns of tension that you're able to let go of, that you're willing to let go of, now begin to settle with yourself just as you are, resting in the spaces of your own body without wishing or wanting things to be different. Taking up residence in those spaces with a sense of presence and awareness, a feeling of belonging to yourself. And as you draw your attention now into the spaces of body, breathing as if your whole body were breathing in, as if your whole body were breathing out, as if you could feel the pores of your skin breathing. As if you could feel yourself breathing from your skin to your bones and your bones to your skin. A sense of residency and presence in all of the spaces of body. And after embodying your awareness, now begin to center yourself, gathering your attention now to the tip of the nose, and begin to sense and feel the breath passing through the nostrils, tracing and tracking the breath from the tip of the nose to the center of the mind, and the center of the mind to the tip of the nose. And just letting this awareness of breath passing through the nostrils stay in the foreground of your awareness, while all thought and sensation, all feeling settles into the background of your awareness. You might even say to yourself internally, I am breathing in, I am breathing out. I am breathing in, I am breathing out. And as the mind rides the breath like a wave, noticing if any thoughts or feelings push into the foreground of your awareness, just pause for a moment and without judgment or comment, just let your attention shift back to the breath passing through the nostrils. And in this way, centering yourself with each breath. Sitting quietly, observing. when you feel ready, letting the gaze of the eyes fall open and downward, and just sitting with a 50-50 gaze, where 50% of your awareness is still lingering in your interior world, and 50% of your awareness is gently opening to the exterior world. And as you deepen the in-breath and lengthen the out-breath, let the breath spread out now once again. Let your whole body breathe. Let the breath redefine the edges and the boundaries of body. And noting that sense of spaciousness. Notice that feeling of peace and stillness. Knowing that that feeling is always there inside of you. And it just needs to be returned to. Letting yourself make a very smooth transition back to your day and back to your life. And carrying that sense of embodiment with you, that sense of presence. Thank you for letting me share that, Kiki.
Well, thank you so much. That was really, really beautiful. You have the most soothing, wonderful voice, and I'm sure that I could listen to that for hours. And also, I love the concept of finding that stillness inside that you then carry with you throughout your day, and that it's always there. And so, I think that's really beautiful. And thank you for taking us on that journey. And I think, one of the things that I just wanted to end with was a quote from your book, which I thought was really powerful. It says, "We are all living somewhere in the space between ease and disease, and the choices we make each day about how we live can move us closer to one end or the other on that continuum of health." And I just want to mention that as a reminder to everyone listening that, so much of our healing power is within us, and so much of our capacity to choose health or disease via our lifestyle choices, which will influence our health. And, by having these practices of relaxation and also the other things you spoke about in terms of nutrition and sleep and relaxation, and compassion and spirituality, etc. All these are all part of the choices that we make on a daily basis. And so much more is in our power. And, I don't want to be too flippant about that, because when you're depressed or when you're anxious, you feel very out of control and out of power. And you feel that, and also I don't want people to think that it's their fault somehow. But there is so much that we can do if we can tap into that healing power of our bodies and our minds to help us on the journey towards healing. So thank you for that reminder. And thank you for all the wonderful exercises and tools that are in this wonderful book, The Centered Heart. And I highly, highly recommend it. And I can't wait to see you at IMMH, Integrative Medicine for Mental Health, in October 2024. And you will be leading us on yoga and meditation and relaxation exercises throughout the 4 days of the conference. So I'm absolutely thrilled, and I can't
I'm
wait to
really looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Kiki. And can I just also say that if people want some of the free practices, you can go to yourcenteredheart.com. And if you just sign up, there's about 15 free practices that you can download and have and keep. So
and
I can
that's
be right there with you.
yeah.
Audio practices. Yeah.
So yourcenteredheart.com.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Susie Amendola. And yeah, thank you so much for that and for your generosity and for your time. And I can't wait to see you in person. And thank you on behalf of everyone at Mind Health 360 and at I'm a Mate and all our listeners. We're so grateful.
Thank you so much, Kiki. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the Mind Health 360 show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.